Before we look at Liederman's argument, I want to get clear on what exactly the view he's challenging is. And he himself makes an important distinction, which I think we've been mindful of as we've gone through the course, but it's worth emphasizing. Liederman says that we have to be careful to distinguish between a concept that we're trying to analyze, some sort of pre-theoretic notion, and a theory of what that notion is. And he thinks that when people have been theorizing about common knowledge, they haven't been very good at distinguishing between these two things. On the one hand, he thinks there's this idea of some information being public. And this is an intuitive pre-theoretic notion. It's not something we need theory to get a grip on. For instance, we can just look at examples to get a grip on what publicity is. Stolnicker has this famous example. We imagine that we're both talking to each other and a goat walks into the room, and we can see the goat, and each of us can see that the other can see the goat. In a situation like this, it's public information that there's a goat in the room, or that a goat has walked into the room. This is a pre-theoretic, intuitive concept that we have, and that we don't need a theory of in order to have some sort of understanding of what's involved, or at least when it obtains. On the other hand, there's also this notion of common knowledge or common belief, which we've talked about quite a bit now. So to commonly know something is for it to be mutually known at all levels. To commonly believe something is for it to be mutually believed at all levels. This is a sort of theoretical concept that we've introduced by just thinking about knowledge and belief and defining a new concept out of them. These two ideas, publicity, the pre-theoretic idea, and common knowledge or common belief, on the other hand, the more theoretical idea, are often identified. But what Liederman points out is that there's nothing in principle illegitimate about this, but it's a theory. Saying that public information is something that's commonly known or commonly believed, that's a theory of what it is to be public information. It's not a given. It's not something that everybody has to accept. This is a hypothesis about what it is for something to be public information, and it's a hypothesis we can examine, and we can see, is this hypothesis true or not? Indeed, Liederman is going to say this hypothesis is not true, that publicity can't be common knowledge because lots of things are public information, but he thinks, and is going to argue later on, very little, if anything, is ever common knowledge or common belief. That, at a very high level, is the theory that Liederman is going to be attacking. But we need to be a little bit more careful. We've already mentioned a few times this idea that maybe common belief or common knowledge is a very demanding state. And Liederman quotes a few people, particularly psychologists, who say things like, to have common knowledge would require an infinitely large mental capacity. So there's this worry that to have common belief or to have common knowledge, that would be an incredibly complicated state that's far more complicated than any, that it would take far more resources than we have in order to entertain. Liederman as a side has a nice reply to this, which I'm actually myself convinced of, which is that, well, we don't have the same worries about other kinds of beliefs that seem to involve infinities. So, for instance, there are no elephants in this room. So in particular, I think that for any number greater than 0, it's false there are that number of elephants in the room. So that's a belief I have that commits me to infinitely many beliefs, commits me to the belief that there's not 1 elephant, that there's not 2 elephants, that there's not 3 elephants, and so on. So in some ways, it's structurally similar to common knowledge. Common knowledge required mutual knowledge at level 1, level 2, level 3, and so on. But clearly there's nothing in the belief that there's no elephants in the room, or for any number greater than 0, there aren't that many elephants in the room, that requires an infinitely large mental capacity. In fact, it seems like a very simple, straightforward belief to have. If that's right, then much more work needs to be done to actually show that common knowledge is as demanding as people have posited it to be. All that being said, Liederman is happy to focus on a weaker position. So let's just take on board the worry that actual common knowledge is really complicated, or actual common belief is really complicated. The plausible position to retreat to is to say that often people are in a position to commonly know things or commonly believe things if they sat down and they worked out all the things that they're allowed to believe given their evidence. We saw this idea before. This is basically the same as Lewis's idea of expectation. And Lewis is understanding something is commonly expected to be the case, just in case if everybody sat down and they worked out, they believed everything that they had reason to believe, then it would end up being common belief. That's another way of thinking about Lewis's concept of common expectation. And Lederman is basically targeting the same sort of idea, although he phrases it in a slightly different way. So here is the thesis that he is going to attack in the paper, and he calls it ideal common knowledge. It says that necessarily, if some agents have public information that they're ideal reasoners, if it's public that they'll draw any inferences that they should draw, then if they have public information that P, they commonly know that P. What the thesis does then is that if it focuses just on ideal reasoners, those who believe exactly what they have evidence to believe, no more and no less. Because by focusing on ideal reasoners, we can forget about constraints like their reasoning capacities and their memory capacities and all these kinds of things. So if anybody has common knowledge and has common belief, it should be reasoners like those, ideal reasoners who believe everything that their evidence tells them to believe and who have no limitations on their memory or their reasoning abilities. That's what this thesis of ideal common knowledge is telling us to focus on. And it says, with those kinds of reasoners, if you have a group of people like that, whenever some information is public for them, then they commonly know it. As we're going to see now, Lederman thinks that even this kind of weak thesis can be subjected to a reductio.